December 16, 1944. American divisions are being pushed back, supply lines are threatened, and the German objective is unmistakable. Split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West before the Soviet advance from the East can destroy the Reich. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the reports arriving on December 16 and 17 paint a grim picture. Units are isolated, command structures are fractured, and weather conditions have grounded Allied air power, one of the coalition's greatest advantages. Eisenhower's carefully balanced front is suddenly unstable. The pressure is immense, the uncertainty total. In these moments, doctrine and planning collide with reality, and commanders are forced to choose between rigid adherence to orders and decisive improvisation. Far to the south of the crisis zone, Lieutenant General George S. Patton is commanding the U.S. Third Army. His forces are engaged in offensive operations in Lorraine, pushing eastward toward the German border. Patton's orders are clear and explicit: maintain pressure in his sector, continue the advance, and be prepared for operations into Germany itself. Nothing in those written orders anticipates a sudden strategic reversal requiring a wholesale change of direction. Yet Patton has long believed that modern warfare rewards commanders who anticipate rather than react, and he has spent weeks thinking about the possibility of a German counterstroke. As early intelligence hints at a buildup opposite the Ardennes, Patton instructs his staff to quietly draft contingency plans. These plans are not requested by higher headquarters, nor are they formally approved. They exist in a gray area between preparation and insubordination. Patton's reasoning is simple and brutally pragmatic. If the Germans attack, the Allies will need mobile forces capable of responding immediately, and time lost to planning after the fact will cost lives and territory. On December 18, Eisenhower convenes a high-level meeting of senior commanders at Verdun. The situation has deteriorated rapidly. Bastogne, a critical road junction, is under threat. German armored spearheads are advancing faster than anticipated. Eisenhower asks a direct question: how soon can any Allied force counterattack into the southern flank of the German Bulge? Most commanders speak in terms of days or weeks. The weather is terrible, the roads are clogged, and units are already committed elsewhere. When Patton speaks, the room goes silent. He states that he can attack within 48 hours. The claim is so startling that Eisenhower initially assumes he has misheard. Patton explains that he can pivot 3 divisions of Third Army northward, reorient their supply lines, and strike the German flank before the enemy can consolidate. This is not what his current orders require. It is not what standard operational planning would recommend under such conditions. It is, however, exactly the kind of bold maneuver the situation demands. Eisenhower authorizes Patton to proceed, but the authorization itself is less significant than the fact that Patton has already begun. Orders are sent, units are alerted, and columns of tanks and trucks begin one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers of World War II. In freezing temperatures and appalling road conditions, entire divisions execute a 90-degree turn while in contact with the enemy, maintaining cohesion under constant logistical strain. This decision carries enormous risk. If Patton's movement fails, Third Army could be overextended and vulnerable to counterattack. If coordination breaks down, units could arrive piecemeal and be destroyed. If the Germans detect the shift early enough, they could adjust their plans and exploit the chaos. Patton understands these risks, but he accepts them because the alternative, waiting for perfect conditions, guarantees failure. As Third Army moves north, the pressure intensifies. Fuel shortages threaten to immobilize armored units. Communications falter. Infantry marches through snow with inadequate winter clothing. Yet momentum builds as Patton's forces close on Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division is surrounded. The Germans believe the encircled Americans are on the brink of collapse, but Patton's attack changes the operational calculus. German commanders are forced to divert forces from their main advance, to contain a threat they had not anticipated. On December 26, Patton's spearheads break through to Bastogne. The relief of the town is not merely a tactical success, it is a strategic turning point. The German timetable is shattered. The offensive loses coherence as Allied air power, finally unleashed by clearing weather, begins to devastate exposed German columns. What began as a bold gamble becomes a decisive contribution to Allied recovery. Patton's actions during the Battle of the Bulge exemplify the tension between orders and initiative in World War II. He did not openly defy Eisenhower, but he acted beyond the narrow interpretation of his directives, exploiting ambiguity to create options before permission was formally granted. This approach was controversial even at the time. Critics argued that such behavior undermined unity of command and risked catastrophic failure. Supporters countered that without such initiative, the Allies might have lost the campaign's momentum, or worse. The consequences of Patton's decision extend beyond the Ardennes. His maneuver reinforces a lesson learned repeatedly throughout the war. In fast-moving, mechanized conflict, rigid command structures can become liabilities. Speed creates its own form of security, disrupting enemy plans and forcing constant reaction. Yet speed without discipline courts disaster, and Patton's success rests as much on staff competence and unit professionalism as on personal audacity. As the German offensive collapses in January 1945, the Allies regain the initiative. The road to the Rhine reopens, and the end of the war in Europe comes into view. But the episode leaves enduring questions for military historians and professionals. Where is the line between justified initiative and unacceptable disobedience? How much authority should commanders exercise in anticipating orders not yet given? And how should responsibility be assigned when such risks succeed or fail? These questions are inseparable from the reality of World War II, a conflict defined by uncertainty, pressure, and irreversible consequences. Patton's decision to redirect Third Army in December 1944 did not occur in a vacuum. It was shaped by experience, personality, and an acute understanding of time as the most precious commodity on the battlefield. In choosing to act before being told exactly how to act, Patton altered the course of a campaign and demonstrated how individual judgment, exercised under extreme conditions, could reshape the battlefield in ways no written order ever fully could. As the fighting in the Ardennes subsides, the implications of Patton's decision ripple outward across the Allied command structure. Eisenhower does not publicly celebrate the maneuver as an act of defiance or singular genius. Instead, he absorbs it into the broader narrative of Allied adaptability. Privately, however, senior staff officers recognize that the rapid reorientation of Third Army has exposed a fundamental truth about late-war operations in Europe. By the winter of 1944-1945, the German army no longer possesses the operational flexibility to recover once its tempo is disrupted. Patton's gamble works not because it is reckless, but because it exploits a structural weakness in an enemy already strained to the breaking point. German commanders in the Ardennes later report that Patton's attack from the south produces immediate confusion. Intelligence estimates had assumed Third Army was fully committed far to the east, focused on its own sector. The sudden appearance of American armor striking toward Bastogne forces emergency redeployments under fire, draining fuel reserves and shattering already fragile command cohesion. Units intended for exploitation are instead pulled back into defensive roles, and the carefully staged German timetable begins to collapse. The offensive, conceived as a decisive blow, devolves into a desperate attempt to avoid encirclement. Within Third Army itself, the cost of speed becomes painfully clear. Vehicles break down in sub-zero temperatures. Fuel convoys operate on razor-thin margins, often reaching frontline units with hours to spare. Infantry regiments fight with minimal rest, moving from attack to attack without the pauses normally expected in doctrine. Patton's headquarters tracks casualties with growing concern, fully aware that relentless momentum exacts a human toll. Yet the calculation remains stark. Slowing down would give the Germans breathing space they can ill afford. The episode also intensifies existing debates among Allied commanders about operational control. Montgomery, whose forces hold the northern shoulder of the Bulge, views the campaign through a fundamentally different lens. He emphasizes consolidation, deliberate counterattacks, and the restoration of a stable front before advancing again. Patton's approach, by contrast, treats instability as an opportunity rather than a danger. The friction between these philosophies does not disappear after the Ardennes. Instead, it becomes more pronounced as Allied armies prepare for the final drive into Germany. Early January 1945, with the German offensive definitively contained, Eisenhower reasserts centralized control over the Allied advance. Orders are clarified, boundaries adjusted, and logistics rebalanced. Patton complies outwardly, but his staff continues to plan aggressively, seeking opportunities to exploit German weakness before resistance stiffens again. The lesson he draws from the Ardennes is simple. Hesitation allows the enemy to recover, while pressure compounds their errors. As the Allies push toward the Rhine, German resistance becomes increasingly uneven. In some sectors, defenders fight with fanatical determination. In others, entire units surrender at the first serious contact. Patton's Third Army encounters both extremes. Rapid thrusts capture bridges, road junctions, and supply depots faster than intelligence assessments predict. Each success reinforces Patton's belief that speed is not merely a tactic, but a strategic weapon, capable of unraveling enemy systems faster than they can adapt. At the same time, the ethical and command implications of Patton's behavior remain unresolved. His willingness to stretch or reinterpret orders continues to alarm some superiors, even as results accumulate in his favor. The Ardennes episode becomes a reference point in internal discussions, a case study in the balance between initiative and discipline. No formal reprimand is issued, but neither is Patton's conduct explicitly endorsed as a model for all commanders. By February 1945, the Western Front is no longer defined by crisis but by pursuit. The German army is retreating on multiple axes, its resources depleted, its morale fractured. Patton's Third Army advances with a confidence born of recent success, yet always under the shadow of the risks that such confidence entails. Every rapid advance threatens to outrun supply lines. Every bold maneuver risks isolation. The pressure has not vanished. It has merely changed form. What remains from December 1944 is a clearer understanding of how modern war rewards those willing to act decisively under uncertainty. Patton's choice to move without waiting for perfect clarity reshaped a critical moment in World War II, not through defiance alone, but through an unrelenting focus on momentum as a force multiplier. The battlefield he altered in the Ardennes becomes a proving ground for ideas that will influence the final months of the war, as Allied commanders grapple with how far speed can carry them before its costs finally outweigh its advantages. As March 1945 approaches, the consequences of those ideas become increasingly visible along the western banks of the Rhine. German defenses, once organized around coherent army groups, now fracture into isolated pockets of resistance. Patton's Third Army encounters this fragmentation firsthand. Entire towns are taken before German commanders can issue orders, while other positions erupt into sudden, violent clashes as desperate units attempt to prove their loyalty or delay the inevitable. The battlefield is no longer defined by clear fronts but by speed, surprise, and the constant pressure of movement. Inside Third Army headquarters, planning sessions grow shorter and more aggressive. Patton demands options that allow him to move immediately rather than contingencies that require days of preparation. His staff officers, many of them exhausted from months of high-tempo operations, learn to anticipate his expectations. Maps are marked with broad arrows instead of finely detailed phase lines. The assumption is no longer that resistance will be methodical, but that it will be erratic, collapsing in one sector while flaring violently in another. German intelligence reports during this period reflect growing alarm. Patton's formations appear, withdraw, and reappear along unexpected axes, making it difficult to determine his true objectives. Attempts to establish defensive lines are repeatedly overtaken by events. Units ordered to hold ground find their flanks exposed within hours, while reserves intended for counterattack arrive to discover the battle has already moved past them. The inability to regain tempo becomes a defining weakness of the German position. Logistics, however, remain a constant constraint. The same speed that enables Patton's advances threatens to undermine them. Fuel shortages force commanders to prioritize which spearheads can continue forward and which must pause. Ammunition expenditure remains high as scattered resistance requires repeated clearing actions. Patton's insistence on momentum places relentless strain on supply officers, who operate under the knowledge that failure to deliver on time could halt an entire offensive thrust. At higher levels of Allied command, the debate over Patton's methods continues quietly but persistently. Eisenhower recognizes that Third Army's advances are accelerating the overall collapse of German resistance, yet he remains wary of allowing any single commander too much operational independence. The memory of the Ardennes still looms large, a success born of urgency and initiative, but one that could easily have ended in disaster had circumstances shifted only slightly. For Patton, the lesson of the winter campaign has hardened into conviction. He believes the enemy no longer has the capacity to recover from rapid blows, and that every pause risks restoring coherence to German defenses. This belief shapes his conduct as the Allies approach the Rhine crossings. When opportunities appear, bridges seized intact, crossings forced under fire, Patton presses forward with minimal delay, arguing that hesitation would squander advantages paid for in blood. German soldiers captured during these operations often describe confusion rather than defeat. Orders arrive too late or contradict one another. Communications fail. Commanders disappear or are killed, leaving junior officers to make decisions with incomplete information. Against this backdrop, Patton's aggressive tempo magnifies German uncertainty, turning localized confusion into operational collapse. By the time Allied forces begin pushing deeper into central Germany, it is clear that the balance between caution and speed has decisively shifted. The battlefield now rewards commanders who can exploit fleeting opportunities rather than those who wait for perfect conditions. Patton's actions, once controversial, increasingly appear aligned with the realities of a war entering its final phase. Yet the underlying tension remains unresolved. Speed continues to generate results, but at a cost measured in exhaustion, casualties, and logistical risk. Each advance carries the implicit question of how long such pressure can be sustained before it breaks the attacker as well as the defender. In this uncertain space between success and overreach, Patton continues to operate, shaping the final months of World War II through a relentless belief that the fastest army, not the most careful one, will determine how the war ends. As April 1945 begins, that question of endurance hangs over every mile Third Army advances. The pace has transformed roads into bottlenecks of steel and dust. Columns of armor stretch for miles, engines overheating, crews sleeping beside their vehicles in brief snatches whenever movement pauses. Patton is fully aware of the strain, yet he views fatigue as a temporary condition and delay as a permanent mistake. In his mind, exhausted soldiers can recover, lost opportunities cannot. The German command structure, already weakened, struggles to adapt to this relentless pressure. Orders issued from higher headquarters assume units still exist in coherent form, when in reality many formations have been reduced to fragments. Kampfgruppen appear on maps long after they have ceased to function in reality. Patton's forces repeatedly overrun command posts, capturing radios still transmitting outdated instructions. The tempo of Third Army operations effectively outruns German decision-making cycles. Civilian populations now become an unavoidable factor in the campaign. Towns fall with minimal resistance, often surrendered by local officials who recognize the futility of further fighting. Patton's rapid advances push his soldiers into areas where Nazi authority has collapsed, but where chaos and uncertainty remain. Displaced persons, forced laborers, and refugees flood the roads, complicating movement and straining already thin logistical networks. These scenes reinforce Patton's belief that the war must be ended as quickly as possible, regardless of the risks inherent in rapid advance. Within Eisenhower's headquarters, reports from Third Army arrive with increasing frequency. They describe not only territorial gains, but entire German formations dissolving under pressure. Eisenhower understands the strategic value of this momentum, even as he balances it against the need to maintain cohesion across the Allied front. He allows Patton a wide operational leash, calculating that the benefits outweigh the dangers as long as coordination with neighboring armies is maintained. Patton's subordinates adapt to his expectations. Corps and division commanders learn to act on intent rather than waiting for detailed orders. Decisions that once required approval from multiple layers of command are now made on the spot. This decentralization accelerates operations, but it also magnifies the consequences of error. A wrong turn, a misjudged river crossing, or a fuel convoy delayed by hours can abruptly halt a thrust that was meant to shatter German resistance. German attempts to reassert control increasingly rely on symbolism rather than substance. Orders to hold ground to the last man are issued to units that lack ammunition, fuel, or even clear knowledge of their own flanks. In some sectors, resistance stiffens briefly as fanatical elements attempt to demonstrate loyalty, only to be crushed by overwhelming Allied firepower and maneuver. These last stands serve more to underscore the collapse than to reverse it. As Third Army crosses deeper into Germany, Patton's confidence grows sharper, bordering on defiance. He views higher headquarters directives as guidelines rather than constraints, interpreting them in ways that favor continued movement. His belief that initiative wins wars becomes self-reinforcing with each successful advance. Every captured town, every encircled enemy unit, strengthens his conviction that caution at this stage would only prolong suffering on both sides. Yet the risks he accepts do not disappear. Supply lines stretch thinner with each mile. Units at the front operate on narrow margins, sometimes advancing on fuel measured in hours rather than days. Patton acknowledges these dangers privately, but publicly he frames them as acceptable costs of decisive action. He expects his army to live off momentum, seizing enemy supplies when possible and trusting that Allied logistics will catch up. By late April, the operational picture reflects a paradox. The faster Third Army moves, the less organized the enemy becomes, but the more fragile the Allied advance appears on paper. Maps show long, narrow thrusts extending deep into hostile territory, vulnerable to counterattack that never fully materializes. German forces lack the cohesion and resources to exploit these apparent weaknesses, validating Patton's gamble in real time. In this environment, pressure, uncertainty, and consequence converge daily. Decisions made in minutes reshape entire sectors of the front. Opportunities appear and vanish with equal speed. Patton continues to drive his army forward, convinced that history will judge hesitation more harshly than risk, and that in the final calculus of World War II, relentless momentum will matter more than flawless execution. As May 1945 approaches, the German military collapse becomes unmistakable. Cities once defended with fanatical insistence now surrender without a shot. Rivers, bridges, and rail lines, which would have previously dictated operational planning, now become mere obstacles to be seized or bypassed. Patton's forces, moving faster than anyone anticipated, exploit these vulnerabilities, transforming speed into both strategy and weapon. The terrain, the weather, and even the enemy's morale are all variables that Patton manipulates through relentless forward pressure. Patton's staff observes that the longer the army maintains its momentum, the more chaos erupts behind enemy lines. German units, cut off from command, begin to disintegrate as soldiers desert or surrender en masse. Entire logistical networks collapse, leaving defenders with insufficient ammunition, fuel, or medical supplies. The speed of Third Army's advance amplifies these fractures, turning small tactical victories into operational and strategic windfalls. Patton's approach demonstrates that in late-war Europe, timing and tempo often mattered more than massed firepower or static defenses. The lessons of the Ardennes and subsequent operations solidify in Patton's mind. Initiative must be maintained at all costs. He emphasizes that hesitation allows the enemy to regroup and recover, turning what should be fleeting advantage into prolonged attrition. Orders from higher headquarters are interpreted with flexibility, always prioritizing speed and opportunity over rigid adherence to pre-existing plans. Third Army's commanders internalize this philosophy, adjusting their decision-making processes to react instantly to emerging situations rather than waiting for explicit instructions. At the operational level, this approach creates both remarkable success and continuous stress. Columns of tanks, artillery, and mechanized infantry push forward over roads cluttered with abandoned vehicles, refugees, and retreating enemy units. Supply lines stretch to breaking point. Communications are sometimes improvised using captured German equipment or civilian telegraph lines. Medical units struggle to keep pace with wounded soldiers, and fuel convoys operate under constant threat of mechanical failure. Every success requires coordination under extreme pressure, yet the army moves faster than anyone anticipated. Allied intelligence reports increasingly highlight the psychological impact of Patton's advances on German commanders. The unpredictability of Third Army's movements fosters panic and disorganization. German forces that might have resisted in strength instead collapse, surrender, or misallocate their remaining assets. Patton's decisions demonstrate that speed and audacity can amplify the effectiveness of even smaller forces, transforming tactical maneuver into strategic consequence. By mid-May, the operational environment in central Germany has been fundamentally altered. Patton's forces now operate in areas that were, just weeks earlier, considered secure by German planners. The rapid penetration of these sectors forces the remaining Wehrmacht to make desperate decisions, often at the expense of coherent defense. Bridges and towns that should have been fortified are captured intact. Encirclements occur spontaneously as advancing American columns intersect with retreating German units. The Third Army's tempo, unrelenting and adaptive, reshapes the battlefield in real time. Even as the war nears its conclusion, Patton's philosophy continues to influence decision-making across the Allied command. His belief in initiative over deliberation, momentum over meticulous preparation, and decisiveness over caution proves prescient. Each captured unit, each seized town, each collapsed defensive line reinforces the principle that in modern mobile warfare, speed and adaptability can determine outcomes as decisively as numerical superiority or firepower. The lessons of these final months echo beyond World War II, illustrating the enduring impact of Patton's operational mindset on the theory and practice of war.